So we're going to have Paul Kovacs. He's smiling, so and his muting's off. So if we could pull up the presentation of Paul Kovacs, that's the one, who will be talking about using science to build resilient communities. Paul is the Executive Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, an economist by background, affiliated with Western University as well. And so over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you for the opportunity to present today, and thanks to everybody who's making the time to be part of the session. If you can move to the next slide, please. So in the time available, I'm going to quickly cover a couple different topics. So first I want to talk about the state of play. We're talking about how science can promote resilience. So how are we doing in Canada? And then three broad opportunities for promoting resilience. One is reducing existing risk, but another is trying to stop risk creation. And a third is promoting resilience during recovery. So those are the topics I'm going to cover rather quickly in the time today. If we can move to the next slide. So the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, as Gordon mentioned, we're based at Western. We're the leading disaster research institute in Canada. We get about half of our funding from private insurance companies, but about half of it comes from the federal and provincial governments. And we're an international center of excellence in integrated research on disaster research. Next slide. Okay, state of play, how are we doing? So I'm going to quickly go through a couple different metrics, but the overall message on how are we doing. First, our efforts to deal with disasters and reduce the risk is below that of the countries we compare ourselves to a little bit. Our efforts to try to keep fatalities down is been doing very well. We're amongst the lowest in the world, and it's been falling. Damage is low, but it's been rising. And an overall message on state of play is that there's an unacceptable level of damage and it's preventable. So if I can go through a couple of slides, but this is the overall message. So on to the next slide. So this is a crafted piece I've done using some data from United Nations University. They somewhat bravely came up with a sense of inherent risk. What would be the risk of flooding, wildfires, earthquake, a number of different hazards if we weren't doing anything about it. They also have their data on actual outcomes. And so the difference I'm calculating is an attempt to, by different countries, to reduce the risk. So what this metric finds, and what anecdotally most of us in the field believe, Japanese work much harder at this than we do. The Americans work harder at this than we do. We're not that far behind many of the countries to compare ourselves to, but we are somewhat behind the Americans and the Europeans. We're well behind what the Japanese are doing in terms of effort to reduce the risk of various different hazards. On to the next slide. The data available, looking at the number of people who have died in Canada resulting from floods, wildfire, is very, very low. Low compared to the countries we usually compare ourselves to. We've done well in terms of avoiding fatalities. The only hazard I've left out of this, because it's I'm not sure there's as much agreement on how to measure it, is fatalities due to extreme heat. But looking across all the other hazards, our metric compared to the countries we would want to compare ourselves to, we're doing well. This is not the outcome that is the problem for us over the last while, but there are definitely risks in Canada from people who occasionally do lose their life, but there are health issues related to fires and smoke. Extreme heat, I mentioned, is a little challenging to measure, and that's definitely a concern that's rising. So there are some health concerns, but the overall metric for Canada is quite good. The next one. Here's a graphic from United Nations University looking at disaster damage in various countries around the world. Africa and Southeast Asia just stand out as experiencing a lot of damage relative to the size of the economy. Canada is ranked among the very lowest, along with most of the European countries. We're outperforming the Americans and several other countries we compare ourselves to, but we're definitely in the grouping of less damage overall. So good news. But the next slide. This is a trend of payments made by Canadian insurance companies because of disasters. On the bottom is a fairly normal scale over 40 years, but on the left, it's a logarithmic scale. So Again, these numbers are kind of scary, how quickly they've been going up and how consistently they've been going up over a long period of time. The damage in Canada is relatively low compared to some parts of the world, but it's trending up, and it's a fairly established and sustained trend of increased losses in some places where we measure it consistently, like data from insurance companies. On to the next slide. This is a slide Gordon used earlier that we've generated. So if you take the payments by insurance companies, use that to try to get an overall sense of direct damage in society as a whole, including all losses. You see some years that stand out, like a fire in Fort McMurray or a flooding in Calgary or an ice storm. But there's a trend that seems to have been going on, a fair amount of variability in the numbers, but a trend that's rising. And we're getting losses of direct damage in Canada from all kinds of climate-related risks of about 4 to 6 billion a year. And this has been rising rather rapidly for some time. So we're on a trend that, unless we do something about it, unless we do promote resilience, the numbers have become uncomfortably high, and we're on a trend that's continued to rise to levels that these extraordinary events we've seen in the past will become typical of what we might see every year. Okay, moving on. So the first objective was to get a quick overall sense of state of play. How are we doing? What are some of the science-based options to do something about this? So of the 3 broad options I'm going to share, one of the hardest is how do you reduce existing risks? For physical damage, the part that I've been focused on, this is perhaps the hardest one. The buildings have been built, the infrastructure is in place. How do you reduce the risk for existing structures? So a couple of broad tools that science can help us. Mapping, so do we know where the maps are? Modeling, and getting behind what are the root causes. This is getting into behavior on other issues. And finally, empowering the public at large so that you're not putting all the responsibility or expecting one group to take the lead. You want to, as broadly as possible, empower people to make their own choices and improve their resilience. So again, really quickly going through these tools for reducing existing risks. How can science help? Next slide, please. In this country, we have a fairly advanced set of tools on hazard mapping. We know where extreme rainfall has happened. We know where tornadoes have happened. We know where earthquakes have happened, wildfires, whatever the hazard would be. We've got a pretty rigorous history at this kind of level to get a sense where things have been. As part of the conversations earlier by Francis and others, these risks are evolving and changing. So knowing history is useful, but it's not a sense of where we want to go, and we can do better. And also hazard mapping is different than risk mapping. And risk mapping is critical for reducing risk. So science has moved us partway along the way here with hazard maps, and they're pretty good. But the next step is to get to risk maps and risk models. So on to the next slide. Here's just one visual illustration. This happens to be Peach Lake in central British Columbia, Peachland in central British Columbia. A wildfire went through this community. The house on the left is fine, the house on the right is gone. And having a general map saying there's fires in central British Columbia wasn't good enough. What were the behaviors of the homeowners on the left that made their home resilient? And what are the specific actions done for the home on the right so that it was destroyed? That's some of the science needed, the further research is needed that's beyond studying fires and research, which is critical, understanding the behavior of fires, but this is understanding how individuals take care of their own property, etc. It makes a difference between total destruction and a home that looks like it's fine to move back into. On to the next slide. On the behavioral side, this is one of Gordon's favorites. So there's a terrible tornado coming and this fellow's cutting his lawn. I'm not sure, Gordon, if there's a debate whether this was an actual photograph or this was doctored or whatever. Don't want to get into that, but the point of the slide that I was trying to share is that understanding how people behave is an emerging science where science can definitely help decision makers get behind why do some people do reckless things, why do some people do the right things, how do you properly communicate the science once you get a consensus about the right things to do. And our community as the science community can better work on behavioral science, decision science, so that we can effectively communicate risk reduction. On to the next slide. Again, I'm trying to be quick here. Our institution, we have a number of different documents we put out. This is trying to empower homeowners. Go to our website, read this, I hope, and say, for this hazard, here's how you can walk around your own home and know whether you do or do not have a risk. And if you have a risk, here's some things you could do about it. And again, the broader goal that some of us are trying to do in terms of risk reduction is just to empower as many people as possible. If we can get more than 10 million homeowners who understand and can think about their own risk, then you don't have to wait for someone to do that for you. You should be able to look after yourself. On to the next slide. The second broad option, first one is reducing existing risks. The second one, Gordon McMahon and I were part of the efforts to come up with the Sendai Framework. One of the outcomes, in my opinion, of the science behind global research about what's happening around the world, where worldwide we're having more problems, is that our society and others around the world are doing a really bad job of preventing risk creation. And here, the economics, as an economist, are amazing. For a very small amount of money, you can avoid a lot of risk, but we're not doing a very good job at this. Anyway, some of the broad tools available: building codes, better planning by local governments, and designing infrastructure from the get-go so that it's ready for current risks and future risks. So I can quickly go through these tools. On to the next one. So our institution, we've been trying to go to the government and talk to them about how building codes for new homes, which are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience damage than commercial structures. So what's the issue related to homes? We've been trying to promote tools and things that could be put in the building code that will reduce the risk when a new home is new built. On the left is a backwater valve. In the middle are tie-down straps that keep a roof from blowing off in a strong wind event. And on the right is testing so that a roof doesn't start on fire when there's a wildfire ember landing on a roof. This is doing science to try to inform the options available so that when you build new structures, they are less risky and they are designed for today and hopefully tomorrow's extreme risks in an affordable, cost-effective way. On to the next slide. Mapping. So this happens to be a community in New Brunswick, and this is an attempt to give more and more information to that community. Here's areas of high risk, here's areas of low risk, here's how it might be evolving over time. Try not to have people build in areas of high risk, and that needs to be informed, and you need to put out maps. This is a hazard map, but it's also moving toward being a risk map because it's superimposing where people are, and informing decision makers using science about how to plan a community so that you anticipate future risks and current risks. On to the next slide. One of the most famous exercises was the floodway built to protect Manitoba. Relatively small investment has done enormous benefit in terms of avoiding and preventing flood damage. This is taking action in advance so that you can make a community better prepared going forward. The floodway is perhaps the best known example, but there's a lot of opportunity across the country to take our infrastructure, take our protected devices, design them to anticipate current extreme risks, but also future risks going forward. On to the next slide. The last area I want to talk about as I move toward closing. When we do have bad events, we have to rebuild and recover. And that is a great opportunity to do it right and to do it better. Most of the money to rebuild houses and commercial buildings comes from private insurance. Most of the money to rebuild public infrastructure comes from governments. Governments also have an opportunity to provide broader support and incentives during the rebuild process. Our work finds that there's generally a window of a year, maybe a year and a half. If a community and decision makers are ready to go, there's a positive environment, there's a willingness, there's usually a lot of money around, but that closes quickly. So the international conversations, Gordon and I were off at some meetings in Japan last year and the year before to follow up on Sendai. If you want to build back better and you want to fit into this window of opportunity, you have to do the planning before the disaster. You have to have anticipated and planned for a disaster, which is not easy for a community or for a government to do. But for the very large, serious events around the world, it is possible. The Japanese and the Americans have showcased how to do that, and ICLR is certainly trying to promote that. Within our country, hats off to the government of British Columbia that I think is the furthest along of thinking about these sorts of things and trying to encourage more communities to think in advance about really serious events and how they would want to recover, because it sets the stage for all kinds of things like relocating properties at risk and a variety of things. So on to the next slide. Here's the mayor of High River, Alberta. In his quote, he's saying High River, Alberta is the most prepared community in Canada for flooding. Well, before 2013, that was not how High River was described by anybody, not even the mayor. High River was a community that flooded quite often, but they chose to use the experience, the terrible experience of the flooding in 2013 to greatly change their community and confront flood risk and build it back in a very different way.
This is your 5-minute warning.
Thank you. And so this is an illustration of a community that took on a hazard and addressed it full-heartedly and has greatly reduced the risk because they made it a priority. On to the next slide. Part of, again, a broad sharing that I would have on the Build Back Better area, when most hazards are relatively small, you can't really do large change. It's the being prepared for the worst circumstance. This is thinking of a really bad hazard. And if something like that occurs, you could have planned for that. You can be ready in advance. And you can really make a big difference when you rebuild. So it's in this extreme event analysis that Build Back Better has the greatest potential to make a difference. On to the next slide. So to close, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction has been involved for more than 20 years now in trying to work on science-based solutions to build resilient communities. We think that there are very large and rising losses occurring in our country, $4 to $6 billion a year of direct damage to homes, to businesses, to public infrastructure. And much of those losses are preventable based on the science that's currently available. But it is hard to take existing science and use it to reduce the risks that are in place right now. But science should be and can be a foundation for reducing existing risks. There is enormous potential for preventing the creation of additional risk. Building codes, planning, et cetera, are tools that are available. But there is experience in this country and around the world that we're not doing as well as we could on preventing risk creation. And that's perhaps been the largest challenge, to bring the numbers to continue to get worse and worse, because we have not done more to confront risk creation. We are definitely trying to advance discussion about building resilience and recovery. We're working with member insurers to talk with insurance companies so that when they put a home back, they put it back better. And that's not straightforward. That's a conversation we're having with them. And we believe that governments can play a much bigger role in terms of promoting building back better. So Gordon, thank you for the opportunity to share. If time permits, I'd be delighted to take any questions, but again, just trying to share the broad message. Science can definitely help promote resilience, and here's some specific examples. Thanks, Gordon.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. There was a question from Dawn Martin Hill. Did you want to ask it, Dawn, or should I read what you sent?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, just a second. Just to say that what Dawn was suggesting was probably the connecting better, with the Inuit communities and the First Nations communities, Indigenous knowledge, how they've done things in the past. Anyway, we can be worth having a chat.
Yeah, Don, I'd love to work with you. We think that there's a lot of really important knowledge. The one that we profiled to some extent on our last webinar, we do monthly webinars that are free if you come to ICLR and watch for them, dealt with wildfires. Okay. And we talked about if you plant aspen instead of spruce or whatever, how that would reduce the risk around a community. Anyway, there's many opportunities on a variety of fronts. Wildfire is just one, but flooding and other hazards. There's an opportunity to take from that knowledge base and include it in terms of best practices. So thank you.
Great.
Okay, let me say that Roger is now online, so we'll start with him in a minute, but we'll give since Paul gave us a nice talk, Trevor Smith asked the question, how do we address the narratives that people say, well, other issues are more pressing when we should be looking in risk reduction?
So my opinion is that it is appropriate that climate-related risks, disaster-related risks should be brought into a broad risk conversation by individuals, by companies, by governments, and they should be judged relative to other risks. So right now, the pandemic has moved to the front of the list, and there's things we're doing about the pandemic that we weren't doing last year or the year before, because it's a risk that needs to be addressed right now. So the case needed to be made requires an economic analysis. I'd argue that as an economist, an understanding of the risk, but it should be brought into a broader risk management framework. In private industry, there's people like chief risk officers, and that's why I think commercial damage has been much, much lower than residential and damage to public infrastructure, because there's a formal process in companies where this, if it's a serious risk, comes to the forefront and it's addressed. And for governments to embrace this in a risk management process is a healthy thing. It's starting to emerge more and more. And so the case needs to be made within a proper comparison. Where do these risks compare relative to other risks? And if they deserve attention, they should get it. If they can't make their case, then the money should be spent elsewhere.
Good, thank you. So if